There's a warning attributed to Jesus that's almost never read aloud. It doesn't talk about the world ending tomorrow or about divine punishment. It speaks of influences, of forces operating behind the scenes, and of something called Archons. Why isn't this warning clear in the most well-known texts? Who are the Archons? Entities, systems, or symbols of something greater? Why do ancient manuscripts keep coming back to the same point, using different words to describe the same threat? If Jesus really spoke about this, why does the warning seem incomplete? What are these manuscripts trying to confirm, and what are they avoiding saying directly? And what if the warning wasn't for that time, but for now? Watch until the end. Some messages aren't meant to scare you, but to test who's really paying attention. Subscribe to this channel to help us hit 1,000 subscribers, and comment below where you're watching from. If you feel that something spiritual is out of place and you want to understand these signs better, I've left a complete guide in the pinned comment. It's an ebook with information that I can't really get into here. Continuing on, now let's continue. In 2017, two American researchers were reviewing a collection of ancient documents at Harvard University when something caught their eye. Among more than 200,000 papyrus fragments, most of them business contracts, sales receipts, and everyday correspondence from ancient Egypt, were a few pieces of paper that didn't fit the pattern. They were the same age, about 1,600 years old, but the content was completely different. These fragments contained dialogues, conversations written in ancient Greek between two people. One of them identified himself as Jesus, the other as James, described as his brother. What the researchers held in their hands was potentially the oldest known copy of a text the church had banned over 1,500 years ago. Have you ever stopped to think about how we ended up with the 27 books that make up the New Testament? Who decided that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John should be in the Bible, but other Gospels shouldn't? The answer might seem obvious to people of faith. It was divine inspiration. But historically speaking, human beings made those choices. Human beings with their own motivations, political pressures, and worldviews. In the year 367 AD, Bishop Athanasius of Alexandria wrote a letter. In it, he listed exactly which books should be accepted as sacred scripture and which should be rejected. This letter became the basis for what we know today as the biblical canon of the New Testament. Everything left out was classified as heretical, dangerous, or simply incorrect. But this raises a question worth considering. What if these excluded texts weren't necessarily false, but just different points of view on the same story? What if they contained parts of Jesus' message that were deliberately left out? The texts that didn't make it into the Bible are called apocryphal. The word comes from Greek and means hidden or secret. For centuries, most of these works were lost or destroyed. Only sparse references survived, fragmented quotes made by critics of the time, small pieces of information that reached us like distant echoes of silenced voices. That changed dramatically in 1945 when an Egyptian farmer found a buried jar near the town of Nag Hammadi. Inside were 13 leather-bound books containing 52 different texts, most of them completely unknown until then. It was an entire library of early Christianity that had been hidden in the desert for over 1,500 years. Among these texts was the first Apocalypse of James, the same document whose oldest fragments were identified at Harvard in 2017. But what made these writings so dangerous that they had to be banned and hidden? To understand that, we need to talk about a word you may have heard, but probably don't fully comprehend: Gnosticism. Gnosticism wasn't exactly a religion, but a way of seeing the world that influenced various spiritual traditions. The Gnostics believed there were two gods, a good one and a bad one. According to them, the material world we live in was not created by the good God, but by an imperfect entity called the demiurge. This being had trapped our souls in physical bodies, cutting us off from our true spiritual nature. For the Gnostics, salvation didn't come from faith in the death and resurrection of Jesus, as traditional Christianity teaches. It came from secret knowledge, from gnosis, which would awaken the human spirit and free it from this material prison. Jesus, in this view, was not a redeeming Messiah, but a messenger from the true God, sent to teach humans how to awaken from their spiritual ignorance. You can imagine why this view would be problematic for a church that was trying to establish unified doctrines and a clear hierarchy of authority. If every person could achieve salvation through direct knowledge without the need for intermediaries, priests, or institutions, what would be the role of the organized church? But there was another element in the Gnostic texts that made everything even more complicated: the description of entities called Archons. According to these writings, the Archons were beings who governed the physical world and controlled the human mind. They would actively prevent people from discovering their true spiritual nature and block the soul's path after death. In the first apocalypse of James, Jesus supposedly warned about these Archons, describing the material world as a kind of prison from which few could escape. He allegedly taught specific techniques to recognize and bypass these entities during the soul's journey after physical death. Imagine for a moment that you're a church leader in the 4th century. You're trying to consolidate the Christian faith, unify different communities under a common doctrine, and establish institutional authority. Suddenly, texts appear that present Jesus as a teacher of esoteric techniques, talking about multiple levels of reality and invisible entities that manipulate human perception. These texts suggest that Christ's true message was far more complex and disturbing than the simplified version you were trying to promote. It's not hard to see why such writings would be considered problematic. They not only contradicted fundamental aspects of the developing Christian doctrine, but also offered a worldview that could be seen as a threat to the social and religious order of the time. The fragments found at Harvard in 2017 contained exactly this type of controversial content. In the dialogues between Jesus and James, there are detailed descriptions of the illusory nature of the material world and specific instructions on how the soul should behave after leaving the physical body. Jesus supposedly taught that the Archons would try to confuse and mislead souls during this transition, and that only those with the correct knowledge could reach the heavenly realm. But here we find something that should make us pause and think. If these texts were considered so dangerous, why would anyone go to the trouble of preserving them? Why would entire communities risk their lives copying, hiding, and passing down these writings through the centuries? The simplest answer would be that they believed these words were true, that they contained essential aspects of Jesus' message that should not be lost, regardless of the political or religious consequences. For them, hiding these texts in the desert or in private collections was not an act of heresy, but of preserving something sacred. This leads us to an even deeper question. What if we discovered that the biblical canon really represents only one part of the story? What if Jesus' teachings were far broader and more complex than what has come down to us through official channels? The Nag Hammadi texts, including the first apocalypse of James, present a Jesus who not only preached love and compassion, but also taught specific techniques for expanding consciousness and navigating through different dimensions of reality. A Jesus who spoke openly about the illusory nature of the physical world and about non-physical entities that influence the human experience. This portrayal strangely coincides with spiritual traditions found in other cultures around the world. Siberian shamans speak of spirits that can help or hinder the soul's journey. Buddhist texts describe different bardos, or intermediate states, that consciousness passes through after death. Hindu traditions mention various planes of existence and the entities that inhabit each one. Did Jesus really teach about these realities? Or did the Gnostics simply project their own pre-existing beliefs onto the historical figure of Christ? The discovery of the Harvard fragments doesn't resolve this question, but it adds a layer of complexity that cannot be ignored. What we know for sure is that these texts existed, were copied, preserved, and considered sacred by early Christian communities. We also know that they were deliberately excluded from the official canon, and that this exclusion fundamentally changed the way we understand Christianity today. But perhaps the most intriguing aspect of this whole story is this. If these texts truly contain secret teachings from Jesus, then most Christians throughout history have only had access to a fraction of the original message. What if there are specific techniques for the spiritual journey that were intentionally omitted from the canonical Gospels? The Harvard discovery offers us a tantalizing glimpse of this possibility. The fragments are small, containing only parts of longer conversations, but they are enough to confirm that texts like the first Apocalypse of James really existed in ancient Greek much earlier than we imagined. This means these ideas weren't just later speculations by fringe groups, but were part of early Christianity from its first centuries. And this brings us to a disturbing realization. Maybe we've never known the full story. In 2002, an archaeological discovery shook the academic and religious worlds. A limestone ossuary, or burial box, dated to about 2,000 years ago, was revealed to the public with an Aramaic inscription that read, "James, son of Joseph, brother of Jesus." If authentic, this would be the first direct archaeological evidence linked to the historical figure of Jesus Christ. The ossuary had been acquired by a private collector in Jerusalem, but its exact origin remained a mystery. Experts in epigraphy, the study of ancient inscriptions, carefully examined every letter carved into the stone. Initial tests indicated that both the box and the inscription were of the same age, about 2 millennia, ruling out the possibility of a modern forgery. But here we find something that should grab our attention. In Jesus' time, it was common to identify the dead only by their father's name. Saying someone was the son of Joseph would have been sufficient. Adding brother of Jesus to the inscription was extremely unusual, unless this Jesus was a person of extraordinary importance in the community. This brings us back to the fragments discovered at Harvard, which record intimate conversations between Jesus and this same James, described as his brother. But does brother here mean a blood relative or just a spiritual term among close followers? The Gnostic texts from Nag Hammadi offer some unsettling clues. In the first Apocalypse of James, Jesus not only speaks with James's family, but also imparts to him teachings that appear nowhere in the canonical Gospels. Teachings about the true nature of reality and how to navigate through it after physical death. According to these texts, Jesus explained to James that the material world is like an elaborate prison, a construct created by entities called Archons to keep human souls trapped in cycles of ignorance and suffering. Does that sound familiar? To many, this description recalls concepts found in Eastern traditions about Maya, the illusion of physical reality, or even modern ideas about computer simulations of reality. But the Archons of the Gnostic texts were not just abstract philosophical concepts. They were described as active, conscious beings with the ability to interfere directly in the human experience. In the text called The Hypostasis of the Archons, found at Nag Hammadi, there are detailed descriptions of how these entities manipulate human perception of reality. Have you ever had the feeling that something in your life was being subtly manipulated or directed by forces you couldn't identify? The Gnostics would say yes, that this happens constantly, but that most people lack the tools to recognize this influence. According to the first apocalypse of James, Jesus taught specific techniques for identifying and bypassing the influence of the Archons, not just during physical life, but especially during the transition that occurs after death. He explained that these entities would try to confuse the soul, make it believe it needs to return to another physical body, keeping it trapped in the cycle of reincarnation in the material world. For anyone who grew up hearing about angels and demons, this Gnostic cosmology might seem like just another variation on the theme. But there's a fundamental difference. The Archons aren't necessarily evil in the traditional sense. They are described as beings who are simply fulfilling their function within a complex cosmic system. The problem is that this function includes keeping human consciousness in a state of ignorance about its true spiritual nature. This raises a profoundly disturbing question. What if the exclusion of these texts from the biblical canon wasn't just a matter of doctrinal orthodoxy, but a way to ensure that specific information about spiritual navigation didn't reach the general public? Think about it. If you were an entity interested in keeping people ignorant of their true spiritual nature, what would be the most effective strategy? Completely destroying all records of this information would be too suspicious. But influencing religious authorities to classify these texts as heretical and remove them from official circulation, that would be far more subtle and effective. The Harvard fragments show us that this information existed, was preserved, and was passed down by specific communities for centuries. The discovery also confirms that texts like the first apocalypse of James were not late creations of fringe groups, but were part of Christianity from its earliest centuries. But there's another aspect of this story that deserves attention. The collection at Harvard University, where the fragments were found, has been gathering documents since 1896. Most are papyri from ancient Egypt, containing business contracts, receipts, personal letters, the mundane material that gives us a window into the daily lives of ordinary people 2,000 years ago. In the midst of these trivial documents, finding fragments of Gnostic texts is like discovering a personal letter tucked between your monthly bills. This suggests that these teachings were not restricted to isolated esoteric circles, but were part of the spiritual life of normal communities in ancient Egypt. The Nag Hammadi library was hidden in the desert around 400 AD. At the exact time, Bishop Athanasius was consolidating the official biblical canon. Someone, or a group of people, made the conscious decision to preserve these texts for the future, even knowing it could cost them their lives if they were discovered. Why would anyone take that risk for books that supposedly contained only heresies and incorrect speculations? The most logical answer is that they believed these texts contained essential truths that should not be lost. And what if they were right? What if the Gnostic teachings preserved at Nag Hammadi truly represent aspects of Jesus' original message that were intentionally removed from the official Christian tradition? That would mean that billions of people throughout history have only had access to an incomplete version of the teachings that could spiritually liberate them. In the first apocalypse of James, Jesus supposedly foresees not only his brother's death, but also what would happen to his teachings after his departure. He allegedly warned that his words would be distorted, that essential parts would be removed, and that only fragments of the complete truth would reach future generations. This brings us to an unsettling realization. If Jesus really taught about Archons, about the illusory nature of the material world, and about specific techniques for spiritual liberation, then the Christianity we know today may be fundamentally different from what he intended to convey. Imagine for a moment that you discovered that your religion, your way of understanding spirituality, and your view on life after death were based on an edited and censored version of the original teachings. How would that change your perspective on everything you believe? The Gnostic texts don't offer easy or comforting answers. They describe a complex universe filled with layers of reality that most people would never suspect exist. They suggest that physical life is just a small part of a much broader cosmic experience, and that death is not the end, but merely a transition to other levels of existence. Even more disturbingly, they indicate that this transition can be dangerous if you don't know how to navigate it, that there are conscious entities interested in keeping you trapped in cycles of ignorance, and that only the right knowledge can free you from this pattern. The discovery of the James ossuary in 2002 adds an archaeological layer to these speculations. If the inscription is authentic, it confirms that Jesus did indeed have a brother named James, who was considered important enough to be mentioned on a tomb. This lends historical credibility to the dialogues recorded in the first apocalypse of James. But even if we accept that these texts contain real conversations between historical figures, the hardest question remains: does the content of these conversations reflect genuine teachings from Jesus, or does it represent later interpretations by his followers? The honest answer is that we will never know with absolute certainty. What we can say is that these ideas existed, were considered sacred by early Christian communities, and were systematically excluded from the official tradition that has come down to us. And this leads us to the final question, perhaps the most important one. If the biblical canon shows only one side of the story, what might be hidden on the other side of that same coin? What other discoveries might be waiting to be made in museum collections, in yet-to-be conducted archaeological digs, or in private libraries around the world? The Harvard University collection contains over 200,000 documents. The Gnostic fragments discovered in 2017 represent just a microscopic fraction of that. Material. How many other texts might be awaiting identification? How many other conversations between Jesus and his closest followers might be preserved on unexamined papyri? And what if we discover that the Gnostic teachings weren't heretical aberrations, but an integral part of Jesus' original message? This would fundamentally change not only our understanding of Christianity, but our view of the nature of reality, the purpose of human life, and the fate of consciousness after physical death. Perhaps the most unsettling question of all is this: if these teachings were intentionally suppressed, who or what was interested in keeping this information from the public? And more importantly, is that suppression still happening today? The story of the Gnostic texts teaches us that information deemed dangerous by established authorities has a peculiar way of surviving. It hides in unexpected places, waits for the right moment to resurface, and eventually finds its way back into the light. Perhaps we're living in one of those moments right now.